It's time for the Phil Ferguson Show.
Buongiorno tutti. Hello, everybody. This is Phil Ferguson, and you are listening to the Phil Ferguson Show. This is show number 233, and we've got an action-packed adventure show today. Later on, we're going to talk to Diana B. Henriques, and she has written a couple of books on stocks and investing in the markets, things like that. The most recent one is called A First Class Catastrophe. It is about Black Monday in 1987. Seems like such a long time ago, where the stock market lost more value in one day than ever in all of history, even including the Great Depression. And the book talks a lot about that, so we'll talk to her about that. And her other book that I was interested in is called The Wizard of Lies. It's about Bernie Madoff and how one can establish trust in people that maybe you shouldn't trust. So that's a very fascinating thing of the psychology behind it, the emotions, and the unfortunate tragic ending for a lot of people in their portfolios and how much people lost. So hang on for that. I get a lot of emails now, which is very nice. Thank you. You can always send me more emails. Again, Phil at Polaris Financial Planning. Some are questions about their portfolio and a variety of other things. And one of the things I've had recently, a couple people have asked if I would do a live call-in show. And at this point in time, the answer is no, because that sounds like a lot of work. So I really don't want to do that. It's very convenient for me to schedule an interview at some random time and to record this opening segment at some random time and the closing segment, and then I can massage it all together. I can fit it in my schedule 5 or 10 minutes at a time. And it allows me the opportunity to skip a week if I'm so inclined or something comes up. A live show seems like a lot of hassle, but what I can do and what I have done is answer questions that people send in, and I've been saving up a few of them. And so this seems like a nice time to just kind of go over the mailbag. I don't know what else we call this. Maybe someone can send me a clever title, financial mail or something. I don't know. So I'm going to go over a few questions that I've gotten in the last few weeks, responded to via email to the people that sent in, and I thought maybe I'd just share it on the show and it might help someone else. The first one I had has to do with the TSPs that I talked about just last week, the Thrift Savings Program. And the question basically was, hey, Phil, I have a TSP from an old job where I used to work for the government. I have IRAs, 401k, taxable accounts. Should I mix those all together, put them all together so I have everything in one place? Well, often my answer is one of these things where it depends. So based on the way this email was written, I am under the impression that the TSP was from a former employer and their 401k is with a current employer. So I have to address that. Most employers will not let you move money out of your savings plan while you still work there. There are, however, exceptions, and if you have a shitty 401k where the bulk of your money is, you could ask your HR department for a plan summary, or maybe someone in the HR department can answer your question. Sometimes they don't know that this is even a possibility, so it might take some extra work on your part to find out in the documents. If you are able to move some of the money out of your 401k, you might be able to get better fund choices while continuing your employment. As far as the TSP is concerned, if you still work at a place that has the TSP, I have never yet found a situation where you can take money out early and put it into an IRA. So in this person's question, assuming, this is me assuming, that they no longer work for a government agency and they're not contributing to the TSP, they can roll it over into a traditional IRA. Of course, the question is, should they? And I will say, yes, they should. It's a tough call because the TSP is a very nice program. However, I think you can do a little bit better if you go to a large mutual fund company, and everyone knows my favorite in Pennsylvania, but Fidelity is also nice, and Schwab and these other guys. They now have index funds that are so incredibly low cost. They're not as low as the TSP, mind you. But again, we are talking about fractions of tenths of percents. So, it might be a difference between 0.05 and 0.03. So that's not going to make the difference. And you have many more options. That's one of my, the disadvantages with the TSP is you only have a handful of options. If you are closer to retirement, maybe 10 years or less, and you don't work for a government agency, I would strongly recommend that you do take it out of the TSP so that you can have more control over what portion is in the cushion and what is not. So then the other part of that question is combining all these other accounts. Unfortunately, if you have a traditional IRA, I'm assuming that most or all the money in there is deductible and you did not pay taxes on it. It's different than a Roth. You can't just mix them. You could reclassify them or recharacterize them, but I'm not convinced that there's a benefit for that, although your situation may be different. And a taxable account is different still. So you probably are going to have 3 accounts. You're going to have some kind of Roth, some kind of tax deductible traditional IRA, a taxable account. Oh, and of course, wherever you're currently working, you might still have to have your 401k. Would it be nice if they were all simpler? Yes. I would suggest that we have something called the URP, the Universal Retirement Plan, where they can take all these different types of plans and disconnect them from your employers. And you can put in, one flat number and everything goes into a universal plan. Another email that I received says something along the lines, I'm going to paraphrase just to keep their information private. I have a friend whose relative has passed away and left someone else in the family a large sum of money. And it's being managed by Wells Fargo, but unfortunately, the person who wrote the email is not happy with the options at Wells Fargo and is trying to get this person who happens to be, say, 80 years old to go see a fee-only advisor and get a second opinion. And it's not going well. They're not able to convince this person to go see somebody else. So I wanted to talk about that for a minute. And I've had a lot of experience with this in my business. It can be very difficult to make a change. And sometimes if you're a little older, I guess you start to doubt your ability to make a really good decision. Memories get a little harder. Calculations get a little harder. And if you've been somewhere, in this case with Wells Fargo, for a long period of time, and you believe that they've done a nice job, it can be really, really difficult to convince someone to go from where they've been and not getting straight up ripped off to somewhere new because they're afraid that the new person might be tricking them. So it's kind of, the devil you know is better than the devil you don't know in this case. The other thing that can be a real problem is that if they do acknowledge that where they are is bad or not good enough, or you could do better, you get this mental problem that you have to acknowledge that you've done it wrong, possibly for 20, 30, 40 years. And that can be very, very difficult. And sometimes when, kind of like with religion, coming out of religion often requires you to acknowledge that what you used to think you now accept as false. And you have to face yourself and acknowledge that what you used to believe is false. It's not just being more right. You have to acknowledge that you were wrong. And so for someone who's up in years, 80 or plus, it can be really hard for them to switch. And it's one of those things that if they're making 1 or 2 or 3% less per year, but they're happy, odds are the difference is not going to amount to a whole lot over their lifespan. And I don't mean that to be particularly crass, but I'm just trying to be realistic. However, what you should do is see if you can get a copy of their statement where it has all the details of the positions that they own. Go through that. And you can go on Morningstar. You can use Morningstar.com or any other search engine to look up the individual investments they have so that you know exactly what they have. If you find one thing or two things that are particularly bad, maybe you can focus on the person selling those one or two bad things. If you think that the advisor is not treating your relative well, maybe you could go in with them, or maybe you could schedule your own appointment and express your concerns. Just tread lightly, be careful, and try to make sure that they're not getting completely ripped off. If they're losing or underperforming by 1 or 2%, a lot of people do that. A lot of people of all ages do that. It's not the best, but we don't want to break what's working for this person. So tread lightly, please. Another good listener question is, where do you recommend putting cash that you keep on hand? Do you like online banks? What is the best place to get the most interest? Very good question. I thank you for that. For me, the cash on hand is purely for convenience and paying bills. I don't sweat a tenth or two of interest. It doesn't matter to me. It's not going to matter. I don't keep that much money in cash. I think 2 to 3 months is good if there's two incomes and you have pretty stable jobs. If it's only you and there's not a second income earner, so if you're single or divorced or widowed or something, maybe 3 to 4 months. If there's some concern about your job, maybe a little bit more. But that is for convenience. So I want to be able to go into a physical location and pull out money. I want to be able to write checks. I want to be able to do a bank transfer. I like having something local that I can walk into. And maybe for people who are younger, they're not as used to that as I am, and they're more willing to go online. I get that. But the money beyond that 2 to 3 to 6 months of cash, I have that in index funds. And you can have a money market or something that's very close to a cash account that's paying 1%, and you can have a little layer there. I don't really have much in there. Usually it's 2% or less. But if you're in retirement, you might want that to be a little bit more. Sometimes we'll have 6 to 12 months of your coming year's cash flow in the money market account, making 1%. But we know for 100% certain, all the money that you need for next year is already in place and as safe as can be. Then after that, you can go to some short-term bonds. In the U.S. government, short-term bonds, the index funds from Vanguard are probably going to pay right now 2.5%. It's still going to be low. So there's not really good places to make high interest. And something I've stated on previous shows, if you have a bond portfolio or bonds that are paying you more than 5, definitely more than 6%, you need to understand how in the world are you getting such a wonderful dividend, because you're taking some risk somewhere and you need to know what that is. So where do I put my cash? In my local bank. Another listener question is, I have a rental property that I own and I could sell it and clear about $50,000. Should I take that money out, sell the house, and put all of that money into a Roth IRA? Well, I'm going to start with no and then explain a little more detail here. Most Roth IRAs, the limit is $5,500. This person happened to tell me that they are over 50 years of age, 50 and over. You can put $6,500, at least for this calendar year. So you can't take $50,000 and just drop it into a Roth IRA. If you have a Roth 401k or a Roth 403b or something like that, you might be able to dramatically increase the amount that you're putting in from your wages and spend down the $50,000 and thereby getting money into some kind of Roth account. And that's something that every once in a while people forget about that. They're putting 10 or 15% into their 401k and they have extra cash that they don't know where to invest, or they really want to avoid taxes. You can spend down some of that cash on hand and increase what you're putting in the 401k. Just don't spend your cash all the way down to zero, because then you have no safety, like we talked about, having some money on hand in the local bank. So the question of whether you should put money in an IRA, Roth IRA, the stock market versus real estate gets to be very complicated, and a lot of things come into play. For me personally, I do not want to deal with a rental property. I don't want to deal with tenants. I don't want to deal with repairs. I don't want to do any of that stuff. So I use the stock market. I'm very comfortable with the stock market. It's what I know. Are there people that make a lot of money in real estate? Of course there are. Do they make more than I make in the stock market? Maybe some do. I'm sure they exist. It's just not an area of expertise for me. Having one rental property, especially if you have a significant amount of your money already invested in stocks and index funds and IRAs, doesn't bother me at all. If you don't want to deal with the hassle of it, yeah, I'd be inclined to suggest that you sell it. Selling a house right now, probably a really good idea. Housing prices have been going up and interest rates are still incredibly low. So you can probably get the price you want or somewhere in that ballpark, and you can get it quickly and get out of it. But, the differences between the tax deductions and the write-offs and all that, maybe this is something you can sit down with your tax expert, your enrolled agent, CPA, and make sure they do some calculations so that you at least understand the math behind it. But it might come down to more of whether you want to deal with it or not. And if you're getting closer to retirement, you might not want to deal with the hassle of another place that you own and maintaining it. For my planned investing skeptically topic today, it is in reference to 401ks and how the GOP tax simplification, tax cut for the rich, whatever we want to call it, the bill might affect those. It has been floated around, and this is something I actually talked about a few weeks, maybe a few months ago. The Congress might, at any time vote and change the rules on IRAs, 401ks. They were created by Congress. They can be uncreated, ruined, destroyed, changed by Congress. It just takes a vote. That's how it works. Well, it was apparently proposed that you would not be able to put in any money or no more than $2,400 into a traditional 401k. So the reason for that is that you're putting money in there and not paying taxes on it. The government gets taxes 10, 20, 30, 40 years down the road when you retire, but they don't get any tax now. And it would be a really great way if they forced, well, not great for me, not great for you, but great for the government, or at least the Republicans in this case, if they could force you to either not put money in a 401k, or probably more likely what they were leaning towards is requiring you to put money into a Roth 401k. So if you save $10,000 a year in a traditional 401k and your tax rate is 25%, you're not paying $2,500 in taxes. You may pay plenty in taxes later when you take it out, but they need money today. So the way around that is to force you to put the money into a Roth 401k. You can still save $10,000, but you're going to have to pay $2,500 in taxes. If they did that for every citizen, that would generate a lot of revenue in the current year and the next year and the year after that. Where the problem comes, of course, when that money grows currently, it's untaxable, no matter how much it grows. And that's the big perk of a Roth IRA or a Roth 401k. It grows and you never pay taxes. However, if they get all that tax out of you now and 10 or 20 years down the road, they decide, hey, wait a minute, we still can't pay our bills. These people have all this Roth money. They should pay tax on that. It only takes another vote, and then they can tax you in money that you thought was going to grow for 30 years and you would never pay tax on it, and you pay tax again. I don't think that that's going to happen, but Social Security used to all be tax-free income. So it just depends if they've got bills to pay. And unfortunately, it seems like what's driving this is this fanatical desire to cut taxes for the really, really rich, people making millions of dollars a year. If we can lower their tax by 1 or 2 or 3%, they can invest in their businesses. Or if we can cut corporate taxes, the corporations will invest in their businesses. I think that's been proven to be a bunch of shit. We can look at Kansas. They did this recently a few years ago where they cut high-end taxes. It didn't do anything. I mean, it probably hurt the economy more than it helped. But a company doesn't build a factory simply because it has more money on hand. It builds a factory because it thinks it can make something that people will fucking buy. So if there's no one buying, if people don't have any disposable income and they can't buy your products, There's no point in you building an extra factory to produce stuff that you can't sell. The demand has to be there. That's just kind of how economies work. And of course, I will have listeners that rabidly disagree with me. That's fine. Send me an email. But cutting taxes doesn't stimulate the economy if it's cut on people who make a lot of money. And if you put in some of the things that we talked about recently, changing the deductions for your income, for your interest in your house, changing your deductions for the taxes that you pay in your house so that the average American might pay a little bit more in taxes. If you change the 401k to a Roth 401k, again, where each person has to pay a little bit more taxes, you could argue it's not really a tax increase. But at the end of the day, someone who makes 50, 80, or a couple that makes $100,000 or $200,000 has less disposable income. They buy less stuff. That doesn't create demand. That hampers demand. However, today, and this is Monday, the 23rd of October, when I'm recording this segment, Donald Trump came to our rescue. Not that you can believe anything he says in a tweet, but just this morning at 6:42 a.m., he tweeted, "There will be no change." I can't read in his voice. "There will be no change to your 401k. This has always been a great and popular middle class tax break that works, and it stays!" Exclamation point. It's one of those rare moments. I want to believe Donald Trump. So hopefully that will help other Republicans not want to change the rules for 401ks. I'm all in favor of it. I have said before we should have some kind of universal retirement plan so we don't have different rules. It shouldn't be tied to your employer, just like your health care should not be tied to your employer. Your car insurance is not. Why is your health care? It's just an artifact of our culture, our society, and we should change it. We should make it better. So keep your ears open. I don't know what's going to be in the bill, and it's one of those things, they're throwing out ideas and seeing who gets upset. So learn about what has been suggested. Find your local senator or representative and communicate to them what you like and or don't like about what's being proposed. You actually have a chance to input on this. So for now, there's no change to 401ks, but will it happen in the future? I don't know. It might. So it's another one of those things. Save as much as you can, as fast as you can, because you don't know when the perks will go away. We're going to take a little break, and then we're going to go into our interview and learn about the single biggest one-day drop in the U.S. stock market and Bernie Madoff, all in the same interview. I think you're going to love it. Stay right here.
Jesus says that he speaks in parables because the people, they just don't understand anything else. But the parables are often foggy and meaningless, and Jesus is snippy when even the disciples don't get them. He says to them, if you don't understand this parable, then how can you understand any parable? And are you incapable of understanding? I kept thinking, don't teach in parables then. It's not working. Even your staff doesn't understand them. Why don't you just say what you mean? Okay, so Jesus isn't so patient, and I think he picked a very ineffective lesson-giving technique, and he's angry most of the time, but that doesn't make him bad. It's just, wow, I really expected someone else. Some of the parables are not just foggy. To me, they're sort of offensive. Like in Luke, Jesus helps us understand God's relationship with humans by telling us a story about how God treats people the way people treat their slaves. They beat some more than they beat others. Okay, I know this was a different time and everything, and I really tried to keep that in mind as the Bible refers to slavery all over the place. And not only does it not say it's wrong, I mean, the Bible gives you advice about how you're supposed to keep your slaves and how slaves should behave obediently at all times to their masters. But I don't know, I guess I sort of thought the Son of God would say slavery was wrong. But no, Jesus does not say that. In fact, he uses slavery as an example of how God treats people. It was really hard to stay on Jesus' side when he started saying really aggressive, just hateful things. Like in Luke chapter 21, Jesus says that he is like a king who says, anyone who does not recognize me, bring them here and slaughter them before me. Or in John chapter 15, Jesus says, anyone who does not believe in me is like a withered branch that will be cast into the fire and burned. In Matthew, he says, I come not to bring peace, but a sword. And in Luke, he says, and if you don't have a sword, sell your clothes and buy one. Then Jesus just starts acting downright crazy. Like in Matthew chapter 21, when this fig tree doesn't have a fig for Jesus to eat, he condemns the fig tree to death. That's right, Jesus condemns a fig tree to death. Not a parable, by the way, just Jesus pissed off that the fig tree didn't have a fig for him to eat when he wanted one. Not exactly the Prince of Peace who taught us to turn the other cheek. And then there's family. I have to say that for me, the most deeply upsetting thing about Jesus is his family values, which is amazing when you think how there's so many groups out there who say they base their family values on the Bible. I mean, he seems to have no real close ties to his parents. He puts his mother off cruelly over and over again. At the wedding feast, he says to her, "Woman, what have I to do with you?" And once, while he was speaking to a crowd, Mary waited patiently off to the side to talk to him, and Jesus said to the disciples, "Send her away, because you are my family now." Matthew, Mark, and Luke all tell this exact same story, but Mark actually tells us why Mary was there to see Jesus. He says Mary came to see Jesus to restrain him, because the people were saying he's gone out of his mind. I kept thinking, yes, let's go get Jesus and get him some help.
All right, everybody, welcome back. This is Phil Ferguson, and of course, you are still listening to the Phil Ferguson Show. With me today, I am so delighted to have Diana Henriques. How are you?
I'm terrific, Phil. Thanks for having me.
Oh, it is my great pleasure. I just finished the audiobook version because I love having people read to me. I guess this is your newest book, The First Class Catastrophe?
It is just out in September. And as you know, Phil, it focuses on the 1987 crash, whose 30th anniversary is the month of October.
I know, that's just great, fantastic. Now, I've been in the investment world for 22 years, so I wasn't doing work then, but I was old enough to remember it. It was a pretty big deal. But before we jump into that, and I heard you talk about this on another podcast, I want to go over the Hunt brothers and the silver crisis that occurred before that, because as you did in your book, it's a nice primer for what could go wrong. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, Phil, the reason I decided to actually open A First Class Catastrophe with the silver crisis in 1980 was that was really the first occasion I could find in my historic research that showed a crisis in one market jumping the fire breaks, sort of become contagious in other markets, much to the bafflement of the regulators and really the politicians at the time. The silver crisis occurred when two Texas oil men, the Hunt brothers, developed an apparently bottomless appetite for silver and started buying not only physical silver, but paper claims on other silver through the futures markets. And as they bought, the price of silver rose and rose and rose, and they borrowed against that hoard of silver with Wall Street brokerage firms, major banks. And then when the price of silver cracked and started to come down, they owed more than their silver was worth. And that crisis opens this book because the regulatory and political response to it showed the extent to which Washington was still kind of in this romantic past of a marketplace in which stocks traded over here and bonds traded over there and silver traded way over here, and they were all unrelated, and they each had their own regulators and their own investors. And this crisis showed that world, that image of the world, was absolute and out of date, and that regulators needed to wake up. Now, this crisis wasn't enough to wake them up. I detail many others during the march towards Black Monday that revealed time and time again how interconnected the financial system had become. But that was really the opening bell on this march towards the worst day in Wall Street history.
Did you find anything that indicated why they were doing this? Did they think they could just keep running up the price and then eventually sell it? Or was it something more simplistic?
Well, their public pronouncements at the time were that this was an inflation hedge. You need to put it into context, Phil. Of course, the 1970s saw a rate of domestic inflation that Americans of that generation had never seen before. And reacting to that inflation, many investors, not just the Hunts, saw hard assets, whether it was gold or art or real estate or Chinese porcelains. They saw hard assets as the way to hold value in an escalating inflationary environment. And so their public comments sort of position their buying as an inflation hedge.
I see. Now,
that made sense at that moment in our history, although Paul Volcker, as Fed chairman, had already taken the steps in the fall of 1979 that would lead to the finally taming those inflationary fires.
In a real short summary, did the Hunt brothers make a lot of money with this, or did they lose money?
No, they lost a substantial amount of money. The regulators' efforts was not to bail out the Hunts, but to save the financial system. Loans were arranged to allow them to pay back the other people they owed, but this was not a successful speculation on their part.
Well, I'm kind of glad to hear that in a way, because we don't want them to make a ton of money because others will repeat it. And speaking of history repeating, there was this thing in 87, and I know we have a short time frame, so tell us about that and what the hell happened.
Well, it was the worst day in Wall Street history. It was a 22.6% drop, Phil. That would be the equivalent of more than 5,000 points today, with the Dow at 23,000. So the shock to the system was not just that the market fell, and I document that decline, but it was that the system almost fell apart. The stress of giant investors using computer-driven high-speed trading strategies and unfamiliar financial derivatives almost cracked the system. And I'm sure you recognize from the litany of problems how similar that was to what happened in 2008 and really to the financial environment we find ourselves in today.
Well, and it's so amazing. It's like you read my mind, because I was going to lead the witness here, and my next thing was going to say something like, of course, we learned from 1987 and we fixed all those problems, right?
No, I wish. After 87, the primary recommendation of the Blue Ribbon Panel was we have an old-fashioned regulatory system that's still broken into these silos. We need a regulator with a 360-degree view who can look for where the fires are breaking out and act quickly. That was after 87. Well, after 2008, exactly the same recommendation was made by Republican officials to Congress. And just in early October, the Treasury Secretary in the Trump administration basically said, well, one of the significant challenges to the capital markets right now is we have this fragmented regulatory system where nobody's got a 360-degree view. So no, we haven't fixed that. We've put in some protections against a precipitous avalanche of selling that will at least slow it down on the sell side for individuals like you and me. But big institutions can sell stocks anywhere in the world at any time, notwithstanding. So we're not in any way insulated from the kind of panic that broke out on Black Monday.
And what do you think the average investor should do during a panic?
I think we need to understand that we're the mice on the elephant's dance floor here, Phil. We are going to get stampeded if we try to stay in the game. I'm not an investment advisor, and so all I can do is offer the lessons of history, but it certainly shows that when the elephants stampede, the mice would be well advised to just get out of the way, stay calm, stand pat, and wait for the dust to settle. And then I hope they will pick up the phone and call Washington and their members of Congress and say, look, we need meaningful regulatory reform here.
Well, you scared me there for a second, but you had the answer I was hoping for, is just keep calm.
Keep calm. And I mean, because as in 87, 87 was an institutional panic.
Yes.
I mean, retail investors did not get into the panic game until very late, and then on a very limited scale. There was heavy selling by Fidelity Investments, but most other mutual funds did not rush into the market on Black Monday. The people who rushed into the market were the giant pension funds, the giant endowments, the giant bank trading desks, and the Wall Street firms that facilitated them. So, retail investors like you and me, we need to understand that we're just going to get rolled over if we try to navigate in an institutional panic. We need to stay calm. We need to see where the land lies after the dust has settled from this stampede, and then make our long-term decisions based on that.
Well, I love it because it's a weird thing when I look at the numbers. 1987 net was an up year for the S&P 500.
Oh, I know, and we all look at the calendar year and say, what was the big deal? And that drives me crazy.
Yeah, I knew it.
Because what people
miss,
as I describe in the book, is January 1987 was an unbelievable month in the stock market. The first 12, 13 trading days, the Dow was up almost 1% a day. By August, it had climbed 40%. So, yeah, the beginning of January, first trading day in January, last trading day of 1987. You see, they're within an eyelash of each other. But it was quite a ride. That's sort of like looking at the roller coaster and say, well, I got in the car here and I got out of the car there, and it was about the same place. You had quite a ride in between.
It must have been a pretty smooth ride. Another thing I wanted to cover, and my listeners, you're just going to get teased because we have a short time limit here. You also wrote another book called The Wizard of Lies about Bernie Madoff. Can you give us a quick summary of how that all worked out? How did so many people get tricked?
Well, because the only people who can structure a Ponzi scheme, Phil, are people whom everybody trusts. The notion that you'll see a successful Ponzi schemer coming is just ridiculous. If it sounds too good to be true, you're dealing with an amateur. And Bernie Madoff was a pro. He was able to instill trust and keep it through thick and thin. People that are the only people who can run Ponzi schemes. So I tried to make The Wizard of Lies an exploration of how plausible, how human, really, these financial monsters actually are, so that people will understand that they need something other than their gut instinct to protect them from Ponzi schemers, because their gut is going to get drawn into this web of trust that people like Bernie Madoff can weave.
Now, HBO actually, and I watched this before the interview, made a documentary about you and this situation. And were you the first person that was able to sit down with Bernie Madoff in jail?
I was. HBO did a wonderful dramatization rather than documentary, but it was starring Robert De Niro as Bernie Madoff, and they recreate these prison interviews. I was the first person to interview Madoff in prison. I visited him in prison twice, and we maintained email and letter contact, even till this year. But the experience of trying to get him to talk to me went on for almost 18 months after he was arrested. It took forever for me to convince him to see me. And I think finally the reason he did was that I knew him before. I knew the Bernie Madoff he was proud of being, a leader of NASDAQ, a Wall Street statesman, a person trusted by regulators, a guy who had a long and storied career on Wall Street that we now know was the Dr. Jekyll and the Mr. Hyde of his life.
Absolutely. And you said that the HBO was a dramatization. Do you think your book is more of a documentary?
Well, the book obviously is fact-based, absolutely nonfiction, journalistic standards from front to back. HBO did adapt that book, but I was a consultant to that project, and I'm happy to say it was an extraordinarily faithful adaptation of the story. Obviously, dramatic license has to be taken to condense a 300-page book into a 2-hour film, but they were very respectful of my input, and I'm one of those few happy adapted authors in America who feels like her book was, in fact, treated respectfully and faithfully adapted.
Well, I am delighted to hear that. And just a couple minutes we have left. What can investors do to attempt to limit their exposure to this kind of situation?
I think they need hard and fast rules, Phil, that will protect them even from people they trust, because those are the only people who can really get past your password or the people you give it to because you trust them so much.
Right.
The people who avoided Bernie Madoff did some simple things. They refused to deal with investment advisors who didn't use an independent third-party custodian. The assets were secured somehow, as American mutual funds are required to do. The assets were secured in independent hands. And I think they also were aware that these trusting relationships that you have, as much as important as trust is in modern commerce, we can't function without it, are relationships that you need to ring fence very carefully to be sure that you're not being blinded by your personal emotions to red flags that you'll see the minute your trust is broken.
Very good. Well, thank you so much for your time. I greatly appreciate you coming on the Phil Ferguson Show.
Thank you, Phil.
Up like this. If there is a God, if there is, I think most reasonable people might agree that he's at least incompetent and maybe, just maybe, doesn't give a shit. Doesn't give a shit, which I admire in a person and which would explain a lot of these bad results. So rather than be just another mindless religious robot, mindlessly and aimlessly and blindly believing that all of this is in the hands of some spooky, incompetent father figure who doesn't give a shit, I decided to look around for something else to worship, something I could really count on. And immediately, I thought of the sun. Happened like that. Overnight, I became a sun worshiper. Well, not overnight. You can't see the sun at night. But first thing the next morning, I became a sun worshiper. Several reasons. First of all, I can see the sun, okay? Yeah. Unlike some other gods I could mention, I can actually see the sun. I'm big on that. If I can see something, I don't know, kind of helps the credibility along, you know? So every day I can see the sun as it gives me everything I need: heat, light, food, flowers in the park, reflections on the lake, an occasional skin cancer, but hey, at least there are no crucifixions, and we're not setting people on fire simply because they don't agree with us. Sun worship is fairly simple. There's no mystery, no miracles, no pageantry, no one asks for money, there are no songs to learn, and we don't have a special building where we all gather once a week to compare clothing. And the best thing about the sun, it never tells me I'm unworthy. Doesn't tell me I'm a bad person who needs to be saved. Hadn't said an unkind word. Treats me fine. So I worship the sun. But I don't pray to the sun. Know why? I wouldn't presume on our friendship. It's not polite. I've often thought people treat God rather rudely, don't you? Asking, trillions and trillions of prayers every day, asking and pleading and begging for favors. Do this, give me that, I need a new car, I want a better job. And most of this praying takes place on Sunday, his day off. It's not nice, and it's no way to treat a friend. But people do pray, and they pray for a lot of different things. You know, your sister needs an operation on her crotch. Your brother was arrested for defecating in a mall. But most of all, you'd really like to fuck that hot little redhead down at the convenience store. You know, the one with the eye patch and the club foot, huh? Can you pray for that? I think you'd have to. And I say, fine, pray for anything you want. Pray for anything. But what about the divine plan? Remember that? The divine plan. Long time ago, God made a divine plan. Gave it a lot of thought. Decided it was a good plan, put it into practice. And for billions and billions of years, the divine plan has been doing just fine. Now you come along and pray for something. Well, suppose the thing you want isn't in God's divine plan. What do you want him to do? Change his plan? Just for you? Doesn't it seem a little arrogant? It's a divine plan. What's the use of being God if every rundown schmuck with a $2 prayer book can come along and fuck up your plan? And here's something else, another problem you might have. Suppose your prayers aren't answered. What do you say? Well, it's God's will. Thy will be done. Fine, but if it's God's will and he's going to do what he wants to anyway, why the fuck bother praying in the first place? Seems like a big waste of time to me. Couldn't you just skip the praying part and go right to his will? It's all very confusing. So to get around a lot of this, I decided to worship the sun. But, as I said, I don't pray to the sun. You know who I pray to? Joe Pesci. Joe Pesci.
You're listening to The Phil Ferguson Show.
Well, I hope you enjoyed the interview and it didn't scare you too much. Hey, just in time for Halloween, a nice scary show. Biggest stock market drop in 1987. I don't have any reviews to read this week, so that saves some time. If you like the show or you get some value out of it, that is a way you can help me out. Go to iTunes or Stitcher and leave a 5-star review. I would greatly appreciate it. Of course, you can always recommend the show to your friends. I'm getting ready. I'm starting to pack now. I'm going to Vegas in a couple of days for SciCon. I really don't have a perspective on how big the crowd's going to be because last year was their first year and I never got a number. But I'm hoping to have a great time. The wife and I are going to go out a day early and stay maybe a day late. And who knows, we might even see some shows. And if we get some really, really good tickets, we might even skip an event at the conference. But it's always good to see something in Vegas because there's always other things to do. And this is going to be right in the heart. It's not way far south like Tam used to be. So I'm going to have a great time and I'm going to enjoy it. If, of course, you go to SciCon, please feel free to come out and say hello, introduce yourself. I'd be honored to meet you. Well, that wraps up the show for today because I've got to go back to packing. And I hope to see you somewhere soon. Until then, ciao.
You gotta wonder